The question that's on the board here it's a paraphrase from Dred Scott. When he was before the Supreme Court, he asked the question, am I not a man? And at that time, the Supreme Court, in their wisdom, said, no, you're not. Fortunately, things changed over the years. But the question that we paraphrase from that then is, are we not a state? And where this question comes from, over the last year that I've been on this job, we found out through digging through that in our state budget, out of a $12 billion state budget, $5.2 billion of our $12 billion is federally sourced funds. That's the looming budget hole. This is Erskine Bowles. Erskine Bowles was the Clinton White House Chief of Staff. He is the co-chair of the President's Fiscal Responsibility Commission. He testified with Alan Simpson in last March, almost a year ago now, on their findings. They spent a year and a half looking over the fiscal issues in our nation, and in testifying to the Senate Budget Committee, he said, look, problems are real. The solutions are painful. He says, we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. We have 2 years, maybe a little more, maybe a little less.
A lot of us sitting in this room didn't see this last crisis as it came upon us, but this one is really easy to see. The fiscal path we are on today is simply not sustainable. This debt and these deficits that we are incurring on an annual basis are like a cancer, and they are truly going to destroy this country from within unless we have the common sense to do something about it. This is a problem we're going to have to face up to in maybe 2 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But if our bankers over there in Asia begin to believe that we're not going to be solid on our debt, that we're not going to be able to meet our obligations, just stop and think for a minute what happens if they just stop buying our debt. What happens to interest rates? And what happens to the U.S. economy? The markets will absolutely devastate us if we don't step up to this problem. The problem is real, the solutions are painful, and we have to act.
What I tell people is very simple, and people in America are way ahead of all of you. They know what's going on, because when you say, why don't you go back and think of what people are doing at their kitchen table? I'll tell you what they're doing at their kitchen table. They know that if you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And they know that if you spend $1 and borrow 40 cents of it, you must be stupid. And they've got it figured out that this government is stupid. To borrow 40 cents for every buck you spend, forget the charts, forget the GDP, all the rest of it. That's where we are.
I think we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. Let me just tell you how crazy our situation is today. We have this treaty where we're supposed, if China were to attack Taiwan, we're supposed to support Taiwan. The only problem is we'd have to borrow the money from China in order to do it. This is a real mess we're in today. And we can either take the ostrich theory and put our heads in the sand, or we can decide we're going to step up and do something about it. But I can tell you, bankers aren't going to continue to finance something that they aren't sure they're going to get paid back. And the less sure they are, the more they're going to charge you at first, and then they're going to cut you off. And we're borrowing half of our money from foreign countries.
This was David Walker. About 3 weeks ago, we had a meeting down in Arizona with about 600 state legislators. And kind of paraphrasing his statement, David Walker was the former Comptroller General of the United States, the Chief Auditor of the United States through 3 different presidential administrations, Bush 1, Clinton, and then Bush 2. He said, if we don't start immediately to completely reform entitlements, cut spending, and increase revenues, we have about 3 years until we face a total collapse. He says, in the states, the 30 to 50% of your budgets that come from the federal government, he says, you've seen the high water mark. It's not coming back again. What we know from the sequestration, the failed super committee, we know that we're facing 9% across-the-board sequestration, across-the-board cuts in federal funds because of the failed super committee. Every state advisor, policy advisor that we have on state government, National Council on State Governments, ALEC, CSG, all the rest, tell us the same thing. We've seen the high water mark in the $5.2 billion of our $12 billion budget. So we can stick our heads in the sand, or we can figure out what to do about it. And that's where this comes in. This is what the map of the United States looks like in terms of privately controlled land throughout the United States. You kind of notice a difference there, perhaps. What's really fascinating, the states in the middle, well, all of the states west of the original 13 colonies to the eastern boundary of Colorado, they've all had effectively all of their lands disposed by the federal government. But here's what's fascinating. Do you know the difference between North Dakota, for example, and Utah in terms of the terms of their statehood? The date. The date on the agreement is really the only material difference in the terms of statehood. Terms are the same. So all of the material terms of statehood, where the federal government acted as trustee holding bare legal title to the land to dispose of the land at the creation of the states, those terms are all the same. In our statehood, their statehood, it's all the same. So here's North Dakota. North Dakota is paying $20 an hour for McDonald's workers. They have effectively zero unemployment. They have money coming out of their ears to educate their children because they control their lands and they control their resources. Again, the only difference in our terms of statehood and theirs is the date.
But you have to live in North Dakota.
You have to live, yeah, that's right, you got to live in North Dakota. But
Not worth it.
that's right. Oklahoma has the same deal. Kansas has the same deal. Texas has the same deal. It's just those states at the eastern edge of Colorado and west, except for Hawaii. So where's the line? There's my question that I collect royalties on. Where's the line to adequately educating our children? Last in the nation in per pupil funding. Where's the line to unleashing full employment, growing the economic pie, and critically going forward the self-determination of our state, knowing that these things are out there? Well, here's the line. It's this wonderful arbitrary line that says somehow you states west of that 100th meridian, more or less, are somehow different. But no one can explain why, because the terms of statehood are the same. And now Hawaii is really fascinating, because a lot of times people say it's, oh, you western states are different. Yeah. They can't explain why, but Hawaii, the federal government disposed of 100% of the land directly to the state of Hawaii. Incidentally, they disposed of the land in Tennessee directly to the state of Tennessee. They didn't sell it off privately. They disposed of it directly to the states. So this is what Utah looks like topographically. The blue is, again, privately held land. Down in that southeast quadrant, there's $2 trillion worth of energy resources that have been completely tied up, walled off. So we have the resources if we have the will. We have resources similar and in many cases exceeding the resources of North Dakota. They've got the Bakken Formation, but there are a lot of estimates that we have similar resources on shale and oil, but in other respects, uranium and a number of other things. And we saw just this week, we saw the Department of the Interior tie up 40% of the nation's uranium with the stroke of a pen. No coordination, consultation, cooperation with the states at all, and locked up 40% of the nation's uranium resources that are right here. And that has a direct, and then they say it's Arizona, but that has a direct impact on Fredonia and Kanab and all of the people down there as well. Now, this is our legislative fiscal analyst. PILT, you're familiar with PILT, I'm sure, payment in lieu of taxes. What that presupposes is the states are supposed to be able to have the sovereign right to tax their land. What the federal government has done to kind of keep the states quiet is they said, we'll give you payment in lieu of taxes. And so the payment in lieu of taxes, the PILT, is $34 million currently. Our fiscal analysts estimate that even with the land as they exist now, even with Greenbelt excluding the national parks, property taxes alone would be $225 million if we taxed our own land. If we had just the same access that Kansas has, if our children were as good as North Dakota's children, we would have that, just on that. Now, they estimate that the current value of the public lands is $22 billion. However, had the land been disposed of in 1896, as was the federal government's trust duty, and that those lands had developed like similarly situated lands in those counties, the value of those lands today would be somewhere around $350 billion. Just the annual property tax revenue would double our state budget. Not the economic multiplier effect, not the mineral lease bonus money, not any of those, not the income tax that would be generated off of that, just the property tax would double our state budget. We can talk about dividing scarce dollars all day long to try to improve funding for education. We're never going to get there. To think of taking a scarce dollar from someone else that has a claim to it and giving it to education as much as we must fund education, that's our greatest resource. We have a resource in the youngest population per capita in the nation when everyone else is retiring their baby boomers. We've got a resource unlike anything else in the United States and in the world when they barely have replacement populations. We've got a resource that's incredible. And so this idea of trying to divide up scarce dollars, particularly given what we talked about with Erskine Bowles and David Walker and any of the other statistics we can look at, we're looking at bold action is the only way we're really going to get there. Dividing up scarce dollars I don't think gets us there. So this is what federal ownership looks like throughout the West. Now I would make a modest proposal that we just trade places. If it works so well, let's let them give up 52% of their land for a while and see how well it works out. This is really fascinating. Let me go back. I want to take you back to 1780. The colonies were in the midst of the war, and we're trying to get help from the Dutch and the French. The Dutch and the French said, we want to deal with one entity. We don't want to deal with 13 of you. You need to come up with some confederation that we can deal with. Well, in doing that, they were looking at various plans to do that, and most of the colonies had claims to what they called the Western Wastelands, all of these lands to the west, except for Maryland. Maryland was landlocked, and they didn't claim any Western lands. And in the proposals to confederate, Maryland said, we're not doing that. We don't have any of these Western lands. We're going to be dwarfed in your proposals to confederate. We're not going there. And it was a very tremendous impasse that almost doomed any confederation from the very beginning. What happened, New York stepped up in the middle of this impasse, this great impasse, and New York said, here's what we propose. We will transfer our Western lands in trust to the to-be confederated government on two express conditions. The first being that those lands only be disposed of for the purpose of creating new states, and their exact language, and for no other use or purpose whatsoever. And all the other states, when they ceded their Western lands, used that exact same language. The second trust condition was that the proceeds of sale only be used to pay the public debt. And on those conditions, in fact, if we had time, we'd go through so much more of the history, but there are a couple of really fascinating resolutions of Congress that lay it out. There was one in September of 1780, and they said, that's not good enough. You need to get more detailed. And so in October 10th of 1780, they came back and did a much more detailed resolution that laid out these very specific trust terms, and they said, okay, now we'll cede the land. Now that we've established that this is only going to be in trust. And to step back for a second, if you think about it, think about what's happening. They're fighting a war to secure independence from a land baron. That's what the king was. The king and his feudal lords, if you controlled the property, you controlled the people. And when the king controlled the property and he would give control of some of the property to his feudal buddies and they controlled the people, does it make any sense at all, once they've secured independence, that in the Constitution they would open the door even a crack for a federal land baron? Of course not. And in fact, we didn't. We didn't. In Article 1, Section 817 of the Constitution, there are three express conditions for the federal government to own land. First, we carved out the 10 square miles for the District of Columbia, and then we said, if you're going to own land in your jurisdictional capacity, number one, you have to buy it. Number two, you have to have consent of the state legislature. And number three, it has to be for forts, batteries, dockyards, and other needful buildings. That's it. That's the only authority in the Constitution for the federal government to lord land, if you will, to own land. But going off of this, so Congress and money, of course, even though we had these express trust conditions, 50 years go by, and Henry Clay ran a lands bill, and Congress passed it, and it goes to President Andrew Jackson. And they were going to take some of the money from the sale of Western lands in creating states and use it for something else, Congress and money. And President Jackson vetoed it, and this is just part of his veto statement. He said these were solemn compacts. They originated before the Constitution, and in fact, that's the very basis on which we even had a Constitution in the first place. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. And these bind the United States by a course of policy, by ties as strong as can be invented to secure the faith of nations. Express, solemn trust language. In fact, that's reiterated by the Supreme Court on many occasions. I'll show you just two. 1845, the Supreme Court in Pollard v. Hagan said, once the United States has fully executed these trusts, the municipal sovereignty of the states will be complete, and they and the original states will be on an equal footing in all respects. Our children will be as good as North Dakota's children, or Kansas or Texas. Many people have made the claim, unsubstantiated, that somehow the states in the West are just different. You came into the Union differently somehow. The Supreme Court at the very time of our Enabling Act addressed that, and they said it doesn't matter whether that land comes to the United States by cession, by treaty, by discovery, by settlement. Those lands are held, bare legal title is held by the United States in trust for the several states ultimately to be created. So we get to our Enabling Act. And in our Enabling Act, we do some very specific things. We say we will agree to temporarily suspend our sovereign right to tax those lands while you extinguish title to them. That was the agreement. Now, some people look at the top and they say, look, you agreed to forever disclaim all right and title to the lands. Well, so did North Dakota. So did Oklahoma. So did all of the other states east of Colorado. That was merely a quitclaim. And when you think about cleaning up title, clearing up title, the states disclaimed all interest so that when the federal government disposed of the interest in land, there would be no superior claim. And so that's simply something that all the other states did. But the essentials of our Enabling Act then was we agree to temporarily suspend our sovereign right to tax the land while you timely dispose of the land. I think 116 years is beyond timely. Another provision of our Enabling Act that you're all probably very familiar with says that 5% of the proceeds of the sales of the public lands which shall be sold by the United States subsequent to the admission of the state shall be paid to the state as a permanent fund for the support of the common schools. Again, that is the solemn compact. That's the bilateral agreement to be performed in a timely fashion upon which we came into the Union. We get to 1934, and in fact, we kind of ran into a geography problem. I don't want to be perceived as thinking the federal government was nefarious from the outset. They ran into a geography problem. When they were getting to the eastern edge of Colorado, we had the breadbasket. You had prime land with water and real estate that you could produce on, and they sold that land off very readily. They get to the desert west, and the demand for the land was not quite as hardy. And so we ran into that problem. Well, coming into 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act established the BLM. And it said that this act is to promote the highest use of the land pending its final disposal. That trust concept is still alive until we get to 1976. And in 1976, despite nearly 200 years of trust history, Congress says it's now our policy to retain these lands in federal ownership. It's the property law of 2-year-olds. If it's mine, it's mine. If it's yours, it's mine. If I can see it, it's mine. If it's pretty, it's mine. And they just did that act. Well, we had the Sagebrush Rebellion and a number of other things over the years to try to deal with this. The Sagebrush Rebellion led to PILT, the payment in lieu of taxes. You're supposed to be able to tax the land. We'll give you morsels off the table in lieu of the taxes you're supposed to be able to collect. And then we've had the Apple Initiative, where we've tried as governing partners to recognize the partnership and said, please, this is really damaging our ability to educate our children. Let's please work this out and do something. And so for 30 years, we've kind of been down that road. Something very substantial happened in 2009. Mid-2009, this is a unanimous U.S. Supreme Court decision. I'll give you a little bit of the background. In 1893, the industrial powers overthrew the king and the royal family in Hawaii and took the lands from the native Hawaiians and gave it to the federal government. They were obviously not very pleased. In 1959, when Hawaii was made a state, the federal government disposed of all of the land to the state of Hawaii. The native Hawaiians were never quite happy with that arrangement. This Office of Hawaiian Affairs was established to deal with native Hawaiian claims and issues. In 1993, Senator Daniel Inouye ran an apology resolution in Congress. And the apology resolution was whereas, now therefore we apologize to the native Hawaiians. And then it had this little clause in it. It said, nothing in this apology resolution shall deny or disparage the claims of the native Hawaiians against the federal government. Well, subsequent to the apology resolution, Hawaii went to sell some of its lands. And the Office of Hawaiian Affairs came in and said, you can't sell that land unless you impress it with a lien based on this apology resolution, this subsequent act of Congress. It went to the district court, and the district court said, that's ridiculous. They don't need to impress that with a lien. It went to the Hawaii Supreme Court, and they said, oh, yes. You need to impress that land with a lien based on this subsequent act of Congress. And it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Alito writes the opinion for the unanimous U.S. Supreme Court on the issue, and this is about a year and a half old on this case. This subsequent act of Congress raises grave constitutional concerns if it purports to cloud their title more than 3 decades after their admission. And this language right here is very substantial. This is not just dicta, or this is really the heart of the case. But this is not. This is very consequential. And if you think of the language, it's very momentous in itself. The consequences of admission are instantaneous. And it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress can diminish what's already been bestowed. And then this last statement that they add for good measure, and this proposition applies a fortiori with even greater force and effect where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. Think about what they just said there. Subsequent acts of Congress, like FLIPMA, cannot change the vested rights of a state's Enabling Act. What are the vested rights of our Enabling Act? Well, number one, dispose of the land and do it in a reasonable time. And pay 5% of the proceeds to our permanent fund for education. And once it's disposed of, we can now tax the land, and we have the economic multiplier effect from the land, and we have sovereign control of the land. No more do we have the Christmas Eve surprises that we had a year ago, where we get the call to the governor on the day before Christmas saying, "Governor, guess what? We're tying up 6 million acres of your land just because we say so." And you all know very well, I mean, what we're dealing with in state government, we're spending tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars on RS 2477 road issues, Deborah, you know down there. I mean, all the things that are happening. The issues in just trying to maintain our jurisdiction, we're spending tens and hundreds of millions of dollars just trying to maintain our jurisdiction.
Ken, in your opinion, does this also affect the Antiquities Act situation with the Grand
Yeah, absolutely.
Colony?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so it kind of goes back to that property law of 2-year-olds, where the Constitution only allows the federal government to own land. If they buy it, they get consent of the legislature, and it's for forts, batteries, dockyards, and other needful buildings. So here's the proposal. This we've been meeting with the Lieutenant Governor, with the Attorney General. We've got Wayne Niederhauser in Senate leadership is my co-sponsor on this. Roger Barris, who is Natural Resources Chairman, is running another part of this legislation that cooperates with this. But the proposal is that we set a deadline. The Supreme Court invited us to take a uniquely sovereign act. They said it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of our admission as a state to even suggest that subsequent acts of Congress can diminish our rights at statehood, our rights to the land. So we establish a deadline that they need to dispose of the land. We've had 116 years, that they dispose of the land by December 31st, 2014, directly to the state, as they did in Hawaii and Tennessee's case, because we have so many issues that have arisen over 116 years. To just dispose of the land on the open market at this point is kind of ridiculous when you think of the grazing and the timber and the mining, the open claims, the access, the hunting, the fishing that define who we are as Utahns. To just throw that land open ignores that 116 years of how we've developed as a state. So we're working on this to dispose of the land to a state public lands commission so that we can sort all of those multiple use issues out in Utah on our side of the table. They're going to be difficult and challenging, no doubt, but better that we sort them out on our side of the table, and then we can still deal with the leases that have completely shut off now. We can deal with some of these other issues on our land. The other thing we do is do an interim deadline, because setting up a public lands commission would take time and money and all of the rest. We set up an interim deadline of October 31st, 2012, that they need to give us assurance that they're going to move forward and work with us as governing partners to dispose of the land. Incidentally, this legislation has already been approved as national model legislation at the American Legislative Exchange Council last month. We have 6 western states where we have sponsors that are all running this together. You've got Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. Montana would, but they're not in session this year. And so we're working with that group of states. I just haven't had time and money to get to know, on my $12,000 a year legislator salary and the time I sleep very little anymore as it is. And so if you've got contacts there, I'd be more than thrilled to work with them. Yeah, because Nevada is 83%. Federally controlled. So we set that deadline. Now think about what this does. We've been working with Mike Lee from the outset on this as well. The minute we set the deadline, we create a national debate like nothing else. And so with the deadline, now we put Washington on the clock. You've got 2 years to work with us as a governing partner, to work with us on how we're going to dispose of that land so that we can generate that revenue to educate our children and change the game and deal with what we know in a federal economic situation is coming. We know what it is. Anybody that can read a balance sheet and look at a projection trend, we know what's coming. So we set that debate up, and we've got national organizations such as Americans for Tax Reform, Freedom Works, Cato, Competitive Enterprise Institute, that are all ready to move forward on this debate as we go forward as well. We set up the Public Lands Commission to address what happens on the multiple use and to determine if any of the land can be privatized, if any. There are so many rights and entanglements that are out there. I mean, that's going to be a process that we need to go through to determine what's there, how to preserve the rights that are there. But if there is land that's amenable to being privatized and we sell that off, our deal is that 5% goes to the education fund, 95% goes to pay the public debt. The national public debt. Right, the national public debt. That was our deal. That was the deal going back to 1780. So what if they don't? Remember the deal in our Enabling Act. We agreed to temporarily suspend our sovereign right to tax the land while they timely dispose. We never agreed, nor would we have, that they never dispose, therefore we can never tax. So they've got 2 years to dispose of the land and to work with us as governing partners to do that. If not, then we begin to tax the land. If they don't pay the tax, we lien it. If they don't satisfy the lien, then we sell the land. We do some other things that are we do some other things immediately at the outset. I'm just going to go through this. We take the national parks off the table at the outset. To the extent that they agree to dispose of the land, we then do the Article 1, Section 817 Act of ceding the land to the national government. The national parks, not the monuments or the other things that have been created without any consent and any development through the state. But we take the national parks off the table. California set a precedence with Yosemite National Park. When they ceded Yosemite to the national government, they did it conditionally, on condition that they reserve taxation of the concessions, civil and criminal service of process, hunting and fishing permits, and a variety of things where they reserved conditional aspects on the cession of the land to the national government. We do something similar, things like that the land not be encumbered, it certainly not be transferred. What we're facing right now on some of the parklands is not only is the boundary good enough, now they're coming out and claiming buffer zones, and so that they need to have 15 and 20 mile buffer zones beyond the national park boundary. So a condition would be that the boundary is the boundary. Similar things to California, taxation of concessions, civil and criminal service of process, that sort of thing. And then we, in addition to the legislation, then we do a resolution, and that's what Representative Barras is going to be running. And the resolution goes through this history, because in our legislation we don't get all flowery and do our whereases and lay out the history in our legislation, and so we do that in a concurrent resolution and lay that out. And so that's the approach that we're working on. To stand idly by, Mike Lee, as we were working on this, made a statement that has really kind of driven me in what we're doing on this. He said, where we have the resource, and the terms of our statehood are the same as all these other states, for us to not stand up and take this bold action when we know what's coming, we will stand to account for our children to continue to be last in the nation in per pupil funding. We will stand to account for not being prepared, as we know that a substantial growing portion of $5.2 billion of our $12 billion budget is going away. I mean, it's a matter of math. It's not a matter of politics anymore. And so this is what we've been working on. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share this with you. There's still a lot of work to do. We're working with the Attorney General's office, working with the Governor's office. Obviously, there are details and things that we still need to continue to work on, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Dave has a question. Dave?
This is certainly another unique approach, and I've worked with Mike Lee before to try to do some of these things. Appreciate working with the Attorney General, but when push comes to shove, the Attorney General is not going to be litigating this. It's going to be the county attorneys when they try to sell the land. Is there anything, and I know that because that's what I do, right, is we ended up in that kind of litigation. It can be very expensive litigation. Is there any thought in terms of appropriating extra dollars to maybe allow the counties to hire some firm or somebody to come in and defend these because when we try to sell the land at a sheriff's sale, what'll generally happen is we'll get hit with an injunction from a federal court. Have they talked about that at all? Because there are some counties that could, fund their own stuff. Salt Lake, I represent Summit County, they can fund their own stuff. But a lot of the counties that are smaller in terms of population size, Grand County and Juab, they don't have the resources to do that.
Yeah, it's a great question. This is not only a county issue, it's a state issue, it's a multi-state issue. And so in doing this, yes, we need to approach that on the multi-state issue. In the Constitutional Defense Council, we appropriated in legislation that I ran last year an ongoing $1 million set aside specifically for defending our constitutional rights, defending our jurisdiction. So that's already there, and many county commissioners are already part of that Constitutional Defense Council. So that's already established. In addition to that, Representative Herod and Sumption are working on an additional appropriation that would go along with this to address those things. Now, what we anticipate, we certainly anticipate that once we pass this legislation, Congress is going to say yes, sir, and they're going to sign off on it, and off we go, and flowers are going to bloom in the street, and life is going to be wonderful. And if that doesn't happen, we anticipate that the reason we put in some of those deadlines and early checkpoints to gauge the temperature of are we going to move forward as governing partners or not, then we've got the opportunity through our Attorney General's office, and we're already having substantial conversations there with the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General that we take enforcement actions immediately, and we take those at the state level.
Okay.
Yes. sorry.
So you mentioned Representatives Assumption and Herod, and they've been here before as well, talking about appropriation for a different kind of a strategy. So how does your strategy that you've laid out here for us correspond or connect with what they've?
Yeah, they were very instrumental in what we did last year, establishing a Federalism Committee. The Federalism Committee exists for you to bring issues to the state where the federal government is intruding on your right to educate our children. Other areas in our state, the Federalism Committee now, we've got 17 other states that are running similar legislation to band together to, I think as Hamilton said it, erect barriers against the encroachment. In doing that, they were very instrumental in taking allocations of funding from their eminent domain bill to roll that into this and have that go ongoing. The eminent domain bill had some issues that the Attorney General, as I understand it, was somewhat concerned about. In bringing an eminent domain action, we effectively admit that the federal government has jurisdictional ownership of the land. If we're going to condemn property, we're basically admitting that they have jurisdictional ownership and not just right title as a trustee. And so there was some issue there, and so we haven't had any actions go forward on that. And so I think we're looking at this as kind of the next step, and the fact that we've done things like the Apple Initiative, even the bill that they passed, that the idea on part of that, I mean, all of these bills are message bills. Every bill we do is a message bill, but regardless of what the substance of it may be. But that was part of that as well. No, we're serious. We need to take some action, and out of Washington, we get government by gimmick all too often instead of taking real action and recognizing the real opportunities with North Dakota-izing the Western United States and the benefit that has in paying down the debt, in taxes, in employment, in growing the economic pie. So this is kind of working with them, going the next step is kind of what we're looking at that, and it's time to just it really is time to take bolder action. I am I've been just driven by that statement of Mike Lee that we will stand to account if we see these things. And I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer that was the German pastor who was hung by Hitler in World War II for standing up to him. He said, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And, we have some knowledge on these things, and we can see some projections coming, and so it's time to ramp it up even a little bit more.
Other comments, questions? Well, sorry, Janet.
I know that there was some question about the money, because at first the money that went into this Federalism Committee apparently was at one time going to come from school trust lands money, and then I think it was diverted. Can you tell me again, refresh my memory as to what the source of that $1 million is?
That might have gone back before my time. What we were looking at, it never had anything to do with the SITLA money. It's a portion of the mineral lease bonus money. What happens right now? North Dakota, for example, in their mineral leases, they get 100% of the revenue. In Utah, we're something less than a state, and federal government takes its administrative costs off the top, and then we get 50% of what's left over. And so of that mineral lease money, there are different portions and ways that comes in, and so part of that was through the consent of the counties that came in to fund into that. The one other thing that I would add, touching on SITLA and talking to Kevin Carter, he estimates that right now we're losing something on the order of $100 million a year in the value and the economic activity and income off of the SITLA lands, just because we don't have access or we can't aggregate the lands. I mean, if you've got one little parcel in a checkerboard, you can't do as much with that as you can if you're able to consolidate the land. And so part of this is just simply the common sense approach of saying, we already own these lands, and of course these aren't implicated in this in any way. Those are already ours. However, the use and the access to those costs us about $100 million a year already.
Sure, it's access issues. And the other thing I want to know is, have you heard anything from SITLA or the wilderness people in response to what you're doing? Have they weighed in on this yet?
Yeah, not yet, because we're still fine-tuning, and you're one of the first public groups that we've come out and done this sort of thing to. So, because this is really the reason. I mean, if we can't, where this is such a substantial part of our budget, I mean, if we lose 10%, we're already projecting 9% sequestration cutbacks on 5.2 billion. I mean, that we can say that education's only 7 or 8% or whatever it may be, but we lose 10% of health and human services, that 83% of the budget is federally sourced money. those shoes are going to pinch all across the state. And so we've got to get serious on these things. So.
Laurel, did you?
Would it be possible for you to send your PowerPoint to
Absolutely, I'd
your
be happy to.
secretary, and then she can get it to
Yeah,
us?
I'd be happy to. And what we've described in talking to I just forgot his name. That's terrible. UEA. Corey.
Holdaway.
Corey. In talking to Corey, he said, "Well, this is just Apple on steroids." I said, "Exactly. This is the Apple initiative on steroids." And you know, the real question is, what if we don't? But yes, I'd be very delighted to do that, and we would look forward to your help, your encouragement. I'm doing a lecture at Utah State tomorrow. I think they're going to be filming that, and we'll try to put this into a video format that we can get out virally and get that out to people, since we can only go so far so fast, and with the wonders of technology, we can get farther faster. And so we'll be making that available. If you're interested in that, we'll produce that through as well.
Yes, Leslie.
And it's maybe for a longer discussion, but do you see any downside to losing public lands in Utah, or any upside to having public lands that you think will disappear? I mean, if everything happened that you want to have happen, you know, if you lost these state parks, if you lost those kinds of things, if you lost that 20-mile footprint around national parks, do you foresee any loss to this culture here in Utah that you might more?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't want to be misunderstood in any way. Utah is Utah. We are who we are. We've developed, and I think we're the greatest state in the nation. And part of being the greatest state in the nation is these beautiful areas, these open spaces, access, the hunting and fishing, and all of those things. And so what would happen then in a public lands commission, we would make that decision in Utah rather than be dictated to. And so no one's talking about, you know, strip mining the entire state, but there are resources that we need to have access to, because again, this is just a math problem. You know, we can wish things were differently, but they're not. We've never been here in the history of the world before, where you've got the largest debtor nation in the world that also controls the reserve currency, that's printing nearly $1 trillion a year, devaluing the money. I mean, you know, again, Joel knows I can give you numbers all day long. We've never been here before, and so it's simply a matter of how do we go forward and maintain the self-determination of our state. But those decisions being made here in an open process, much like this, we would decide if any land is, you know, if lands are sold, if any, privatized, what the multiple use of those lands would look like to preserve open space, to preserve grazing rights that already exist, to deal with whatever those mineral rights and leases and those sorts of things would be. And so that's just a matter of a public body in our state making those decisions. There may be people that would disagree with that, but that's the public process, and that's how any body like this works.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we want to thank you very, very much for coming and presenting to us, and we're glad we're one of the first to see your presentation. Thank you.
Well, quite honestly, this is really about how do we fill that hole when education is such a tremendous part, and that really is our greatest resource going forward. That's our Social Security, is making sure that we allow you to do what we need to do creatively and innovatively going forward. So thank you very much for giving me the time. I appreciate it tremendously.
We thank you for coming. Thank you very much.